Well, class, I regret getting started late as we explained some unusual circumstances this morning, and whatever I have picked up over the last few weeks, I cannot shake. So that also sort of affects my voice, maybe in a bigger way than I would hope. It's frustrating when you're a public speaker and you can't seem to shake it. I always look toward China with a frown on my face when I think of these kinds of things, but I really don't know what it is. But this is the reason why I use coffee medicinally. I know you don't believe me, but that's my story. Today we are in the Gospel of John, continuing our study of John. We will be beginning in chapter 8. Last week only briefly mentioned one issue that I think we are aware of. It's in most of the modern versions of the Bible, an indication that there is an issue in John chapter 8. So I really do not intend to go in detail into that question. It's not our purpose to be so technical, although if there are any questions, I'll do my best. It is one of those issues that is well known out of a few, and I say again, emphasize few such issues in our New Testaments. Well, throughout the Bible, for that matter. They are so few and far between, they're labeled and known, categorized, and been studied for many years. The issue, for example, in chapter 8, verse 53, actually it's chapter 7, 53, the last part that is not in the section in many manuscripts that we have that follow on the heels of chapter 7 and verse 52. In chapter 7, 52, there was a snide remark, a very snarky remark made to Nicodemus, who I think quite fairly asked the question, does not our law first give a man a hearing and to learn what he does before we judge him? And of course, that is the case with the law of Moses. But rather than saying, well, yes, that's true. However, after judging Jesus based upon the testimony, we have determined that his claims fall short. Well, they didn't say that. They just immediately brought up a very prejudicial ad hominem attack on Nicodemus for even raising that reasonable, commonsensical question. Are you from Galilee too? That doesn't mean a lot to us, but it would have then, because it was an insult. Like, are you from the ghetto? You know, well, that might could be considered an insult today. Or are you a hillbilly from the mountains of Kentucky? Oh, really, an insult today. From all ethnicities. I think that's one group that takes flack from every ethnic group in America besides themselves. So they argue no prophet arises from Galilee. That, well, technically it's true if you're thinking about the prediction of the birth of Messiah, the son of David. It would be in the city of David, Micah 5:2. But they missed the point that, in fact, Jesus of Nazareth, known now to be of Nazareth because that's where he was reared, was actually technically Jesus of Bethlehem. He's born in Bethlehem, and he was raised later in Galilee. So again, in chapter 8, verses 1 and following, the whole episode of the woman caught in adultery is one of those problematic passages where it simply is not included in the best manuscripts. Now, many versions will say translations, it's not included in the earliest. That's true, but there's more to it than just the fact that the manuscripts were early. The better manuscripts, the one that are most reliable for telling us what was most probably in the original Gospel of John, simply do not have it. Some earlier manuscripts have this section in the book of Luke. As I've mentioned before, it's appended into a section in Luke. I don't recall exactly what chapter, showing there was doubt, and it's not known where exactly it is to be located, if it was ever original at all to any writer. But it is an early story that was told. Of that we can be sure, an early story. But how reliable is the story? That's the issue. And if it's not reliably in the text, then we have reasons to say, let's just be cautious. Christian.
I was just wondering when it got added. Do we have any idea who added it?
No, I don't think we do. As in the case of 1 John chapter 1, 5-7, there we have the three that bear witness in heaven, the heavenly witnesses. We know where that came from. That was earlier in a marginal note by a scholar from, I think, the 4th century, a monk who was copying a manuscript, and he made a note and put those words in there in his margin. Somehow later, they ended up in some of the copies of the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate, of course, is the Latin translation of the Greek New Testament. Greek was the original language, and so Latin was where that was found later. It was very familiar to people who read the Latin throughout the medieval church. And then you had Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a great scholar. He was from Rotterdam, that is the Netherlands, but he was in England, as I recall, doing work there, collating the few manuscripts he had available. He didn't have nearly the number that are here accessible. Today we have nearly 6,000, but he had just a handful, just a few, tens, in the tens, or even less than 10. And he had the Latin Vulgate. So he wanted to actually come up with an edition of the Greek Testament. By addition, we mean he wanted to take these different manuscripts, compare and contrast them, and find from these manuscripts the more probable reading, the better reading, the best he could do with what he had. And he came across the section I mentioned in 1 John 1, and he said, that's not there. So, or actually 1 John 5. And he said, that's not in the original Greek manuscripts. He had these several manuscripts. But it was so familiar, when he left it out of his Greek edition, he took a lot of heat. So he basically unwisely blurted out, well, if you were to ever find a single Greek manuscript anywhere that contained those words, I would include them in my next edition. So he'd take those, it's an edition. He would take them, edit the manuscript, put them together, and have one single text based on those various manuscripts that he had. Well, some character in Oxford, England, heard him say that and took the Latin Vulgate and translated the Latin back into Greek and included those bogus words. I say bogus. They were words that were originally just a comment made by an earlier monk or scribe. And so he had to eat his words. It was a rash vow. When Erasmus learned about it, he said, well, I did say that if I found any one manuscript that contained it, I would put it in my next edition. So in his third edition, or if I recall, he included those words against his better judgment, but he made that rash remark. And it so happens our King James Bible is based on the text that came from Erasmus's third edition, the Textus Receptus, it is called, the received text. So, which is a misnomer, really. But that it maybe have been received for that time period temporarily. Anyway, I don't know that we are aware of the pedigree of this one, how that happened. It was just evidently an early story that somehow ended up in some copies. And again, it could have been an accurate story or a memory that had not yet faded, passed on by word of mouth. But I'm not going to cover it. So let's move into chapter 8, verse 12 and following. Yeah.
Since we're not going to cover it, or just maybe indirectly I have. So, in those verses, is there anything that would make you think that it should definitely not be looked at or considered? I mean, does it contradict any kind of concepts, or does it flow? Is it harmonious?
Loaded question. Last week, I briefly touched on that, I think, when I said that is one consideration in determining whether this should be included in the text. But in my estimation, it's more subjective in this sense. Why these words are not included? They would not be included based on the best evidence that the translators have of what was in the original book of John. So that's determined by looking at ancient manuscripts. We have some. One, in fact, of John goes all the way back to about the year 125 AD, only about 30 years after John was written. So we have the ancient manuscript there, many manuscripts upon which we base our versions of the Greek Testament that do not contain it. Most, in fact, of those early manuscripts, as I recall, do not contain these words. And again, in some few manuscripts, these words are not even in John, but this story is told in Luke. It's appended somewhere to one of the chapters of Luke, showing that whoever translated early, or rather copied, were just not familiar with where this ought to be included and whether it should be included at all. It appears most likely from the best evidence we have, and this is all we can do with any of our Bible, our Greek Bible, is that it was not originally in John, that John, guided by the Spirit of God, did not write these words. And again, this is one of those very few, I mean, you can count on one hand sort of issues. This is one of very few where we have that kind of question to arise, and we know the answer is pretty much it most likely should not be included.
I guess then the most prudent thing would be that, I mean, fine, read it, but don't let it trump any other scriptures. Don't let it define any particular type of doctrine that is not harmonious with some other, if there's any kind of a question or doubt.
Well, that would be wise on any count, but that's one of the reasons I said last time I have to be cautious. If I only want to look at the most objective, that is outside of myself, considerations based on the manuscripts that are out there that have been read and studied. We know where these manuscripts are. They're not just floating around nebulously. They're in specific libraries. They've been collated. That is, they've been cataloged, let's put it that way. They've been studied and found to be parts of families grouped together where many manuscripts are like many others. I was just looking here in this second edition of the Greek New Testament, the text they use, the different places they derive information from, and they've named these manuscripts. They have their own, each one is known by its own designation, I should say. P1, it's located in Philadelphia, and it comes from the 3rd century AD. The 200s, I should say. The 200s is the 3rd century. Then you have P2. It's the little P. It is located in Florence, and it comes from the 6th century. P3 is in Vienna from the 6th to the 7th century. P4 from Paris. And so London, we've got one in London, 3rd century. P5. Well, they just go on. You can see this. This is not the complete list. This is just samples of the better manuscripts here in this list. I go down to P23. I have an asterisk beside it. It's in Urbana, Illinois, in a library. We know where it is. And it can be studied. And men who spend their lives in this particular area of research will often take out time and visit these different libraries, especially those in our own country. You have P37, P38 are in Ann Arbor, Michigan. P27 is in Cambridge. P26 is in Dallas. P25 is in Berlin. See, they're all over the world, but we do know where they are. P66 is in Geneva. P67 is in Barcelona. Loretta could have probably studied that had she wanted. About 200 AD. That's an old manuscript, by the way. Then the Geneva manuscript of P75 is available, known as the Bodmer. Then you have a number of now these are like fragments, or often maybe single books or portions of books. Then you have entire New Testaments that are Greek, such as the one that it uses the Hebrew word aleph, which is the first word of their alphabet, the letter aleph. Well, it's not an A. An A is a vocal, it is a vowel, rather, in our language, and it actually is a consonant in their language. So you have the manuscript of it is in London. It's called the Sinaiticus, 4th century, 300s. It's in a library in London. It could be studied. You can go there if you hop on a plane, go to London, and get access to it. In Rome, you have the Vaticanus. That's the 4th century manuscript, the Vaticanus. It's designated by the letter B, the capital letter B. The problem with the Vaticanus has always been access. I don't know why. Yeah, I do, but I mean, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. That the Catholics give others a hard time when they ask permission to come and study it. We just want to look at it. We won't even touch it. Let you monks turn the page. Just let us look at it. They've been extremely jealous about that. Yeah, even scholar. But they have granted access. And in fact, I think by now that it has been facsimile copies made of it. It has been photocopied or something equivalent to that, so that we have representations of it in other libraries, but the actual manuscript is found in the Vatican Library. So on and on we could go, and I just say, we know where these manuscripts are, and out of all these, hardly any at all has these words in it. Very few contain these words. And so the evidence seems to be they were not originally in John. So we get back to Chris's question. I didn't really want to spend this much time on it, but I guess it always does arise. The internal factors, and I say we have to be very cautious there. Here's why. You can look at these words, as many do today, and say, well, you know, Jesus is very forgiving. And if you were to be accused by somebody of breaking the law, and you did break the law, as she did in the story, she committed adultery. She was caught in the very act of adultery. There was no doubt that she was guilty. And they brought her to Jesus to see what he would do, testing him. Now, that's the sort of thing that would happen, you would think, right? The test, because they're always testing Jesus. Now, that seems, reasonable. So she's brought to him, and Jesus is writing something on the ground in the store. We don't know what it is. We have no clue. He's just writing as though he's nonchalant, not paying any attention. It's not a big deal. And they said, Master, we caught this woman in the act of adultery. So the law said she has to be stoned. So what are we going to do? Now, see, this would put him into a bind. The Romans reserved capital punishment to themselves. The Romans occupied Judea. A lot of times the Judeans, who were very hot-headed, would get out of hand, and they would have extrajudicial executions. They would kill people, like Stephen, for example, the martyr later, without the authority of Rome. But when it comes to the question of how can we get along with the emperor and not get on his bad side, they wanted Jesus to get on his bad side. They're always asking questions to get him on his bad side. Well, what do we do? I mean, are you going to be who's going to throw the stone? We're supposed to kill her according to the law of Moses. What this seems to indicate is, although that penalty is attached to the law of Moses for adultery under the old covenant for the Jews, for a long time it appears it had not been meted out, it appears. It just was not being meted out. So what do? They're trying to get him in a bind. Technically, the letter of the law says she has to be stoned. Now in the story, Jesus said, well, the one who's without sin, you cast the first stone. So what happens? Well, their conscience hurts them because they all realize they're guilty too. I mean, they've been guilty. Maybe some of them committed adultery as well, and they're being hypocritical about putting her up just as a test case to try to hurt Jesus. That's all that's as far in the story. So they all throw their ox down, walk away. They don't throw it. They won't do it. And so, where are your accusers? And then Jesus says, well, neither do I accuse you. Go away and sin no more. All right. So the problem that somehow, and again, this is difficult because who are we to decide? Would Jesus have said such a thing as that? If he meant to say that adultery is no big deal, that's how it's often used today. This is a favorite passage of the modernist, of modern people. They know two verses, well, maybe John 3:16, but they know, judge not that you be not judged, and they know this, who's without sin cast the first stone. You hear that? It's a cliche today even. So would the Lord have said that? Well, had it really happened and he had known her heart that she was truly penitent, he would. Had this happened, the Lord could have known that about her. Then he would have said that, go sin no more, I don't condemn you either. If she were truly penitent. But you have to assume that it happened and that she was penitent and that he perceived it. But if she was not penitent and made no indication of that, then it would be like the Lord just saying, we're going to suspend the letter of the law. Again, that's the way the liberals use it today, even though that's...
He knew the heart of the men that were accusing her.
Right.
So
he certainly... Well, throughout this book of John, Jesus knows the thoughts of people, even the critics. Yeah, he would have known everything about it. So again, I guess you could say the jury is still out and will be out until more information could be found. It's conceivable other early manuscripts could be located, like the John Rylands I say John Rylands. That's in Manchester, England, if I recall. He's a rich guy named John Rylands, and he's got a library. He has bought up manuscripts. So he's got this papyrus of John. It's just, I think, a short fragment out of John chapter 18, but you can tell the words are from John 18. And it has been successfully dated to about the year 125 AD. That's really close to the time it would have been written. See, the Gospel of John was probably written in the 80s, the first century. So you're not talking about a real huge amount of time. It could have been a copy made off the original. Somebody could say, well, it could be the original. It's possible. We have no reason to suppose that, but it's very close if it's not one or two removed from the original. So it's conceivable, I guess, that somebody could discover in the sands of Egypt. Why do I say Egypt? Well, that's where it was very dry. It still is. And these manuscripts that were on papyrus could be preserved for a long time, centuries, and they wouldn't crumble completely. Their deterioration was much slower than you would have, say, up in Syria or somewhere there's a lot of rain coming off the Mediterranean. But in Egypt, it's dry. Anyway, something could be found, but at the moment the jury's still out, we'll just say we don't have solid evidence that it should be. If somebody says, but why is it in the King James? I know that question's one on people's minds a lot. And I touched on that a while ago. I'll just remind us, it's in the King James translation because in 1611, they had Erasmus's third edition, or they had the Textus Receptus that was edited by Stephanus, some others, as I recall, also Beza, who was a cohort of Calvin, by the way, in Geneva. They had edited that. They had done some slight alterations to the third edition of Erasmus's Greek Testament. Anyway, so that's why they included it. It was in their Greek Testament. That's why they translated it. So it remains in the King James Bible. But why do all the new versions, even the very good ones like the ESV, the New American Standard Bible, so on, leave it out? Well, that's why, because they realize that the best evidence is not that it was included. All right, so are we ready to continue now? And starting in verses 12 and following, it's certain this was in the original text, no doubt about it. So he's going to talk about the light of the world issue. I don't think that's the only time it comes up. I'm sure it's not. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So, you could preach sermons upon sermons on that one verse and that concept. Chris, this past year and into this year, on Wednesday nights, dealt with that broad theme of how Christ and his teachings in particular have really been a light to our world, especially the Western world. I thought it funny to hear an Israeli talking about our values shared in the West. You ain't in the West. The West actually is where Christianity went. Yeah, it was based off of Judaism. Christianity influenced us also here in North America because we are of the West culturally. But technically, Israel is Middle East, not of the West. Anyway, I thought it's a minor point. But they want to take a little bit of credit for our history, too, which is really the one they fought against all through the years.
There's a significant difference because, they had their form of government was based on, religion. I mean, it was a religious government. We are a more of a, secular, but we're Christians that create our own government. I guess there's a bit of a difference there.
I don't know how I don't think the modern state of Israel, somebody could correct me, I may be wrong about it. I don't think that they conceive of themselves as a theocracy, the original, children of it, the original nation, or even Judea was a theocracy, direct rule of God. Even by the time of Christ, they had pretty much lost they had token rule within Jerusalem and so on, but the Romans were in charge. So they had to kowtow to the Romans. They had lost their freedom, at least by the year 63 BC when Pompey invaded Judea.
Maybe a better way to say it would be instead of theocracy, maybe it would be, they're monolithic
Yeah.
as a people.
I wasn't thinking as much of the government, although that's a manifestation of this phenomenon. The cultural phenomenon is wider than governments, because even like in Germany and Italy, well, especially in Germany, used to be the same problem as Italy. I have mixed feelings about Italy. I like the Italians right now. They're on our good side, but they did give rise to the Roman papacy. So that's on the negative column. But you have In all of Europe, you have culturally Christian civilization. As you taught about, the book, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? And I don't have that one. I've got another one by an author from Michigan, I think, a historian. Same kind of premise. I had Loretta bought it for me at a bookstore or at a flea market or something years ago. I always appreciate it. She brings me books she picks up for a song at a flea market, and some of them are really valuable. I hadn't told her how much, so I spreadsheet up what she expects me to do to get them, but just kidding. But this was a good one, and it talks about those basic categories, medicine, even law and government, but medicine and the arts and how we view life, those kind of things. Look at Jesus' statement, how true it is. From hindsight, we see even more of an application than they would have known when he first said it. I am the light of the world. If Jesus had not been born, if we had to follow, we wouldn't follow carrots like Muhammad. There would have been no Muhammad apart from Jesus, because that's a Christian heresy, a Christian Jewish heresy. Islam is a spinoff of aberrant Christian belief, of Gnosticism, in particular Manichaeism, and also Judaism, and some Arab superstitions as well. You wouldn't have had that. You would have had Hinduism, no doubt, because it's even as old as Judaism. Back in the murky recesses of the Indo-Europeans, we don't know a lot about them, but it appears that some of the earliest views of Hinduism, some of the same views we find today, were held among some of the philosophers of that day. But you would have had, if we had to live under Hinduism or a system like that, and if all of our leaders in our nation and those who are in charge of our intelligence were dyed-in-the-wool Hindus, it would be a dark country indeed. It would be. And we would be going downhill in the wrong direction. The more California-type spirituality, that is, the New Age, that is, Hinduism, hits us as well. I'll include I'll just say the Pacific Rim heresies, such as Hawaii, the more our country is in deep trouble. And there are lots of Patels and hotel owners who come here, millions of hotel owners who continue to bring their Patel philosophy of Hinduism. It's a bad thing. And I will say that, and I will defend that. Hinduism is not a good religion. It is a bad religion. Very bad. So I want to emphasize that. And if you take Christianity, they're worlds apart compared to the bleakness of Hinduism, paganism. And we are living in a neo-pagan society where such aberrant views as Vedanta philosophy from Hinduism are in the mainstream now. Everybody talks about instant karma. I got so upset with that, I finally wrote a 1-minute spot. It's supposed to air this week, probably starting tomorrow or Tuesday, depending on if the radio station will cooperate, but hopefully they will. And I'll be talking about how, no, when you watch a video and you click on the clickbait, nobody did get instant karma. Nobody has ever gotten instant karma or gradual karma, because there ain't no such thing. Nobody's ever gotten karma. And I'm trying to deal with that. We've got to get this junky idea out of our mind. It's paganish. It's false. California's been the bane of this nation since the 60s. We've let that garbage come into the rest of the nation. We've picked up their lingo, and we pick up on their ideas. So anyway, I'm saying that to go back. I'm making some application here. Jesus and his way is, in fact, the light of the world. You remember how a certain part of our history in the West, back in, say, beginning in especially the early 1700s and on into the 19th century, was called the Enlightenment Project. We usually use adjectives. Well, we use nouns like project, the Enlightenment movement, the idea that people would come out of the darkness that was the superstition of the Middle Ages. I know the revisionists now tell us that that's all been overblown. There were great scholars throughout the entire Middle Ages. And I know there were scholars. I know there were some who studied and they acquired a lot of information. But we're talking about how religion was viewed by the average person, how it affected the movement of culture and the whole social fabric. And in the Middle Ages, it was a dark period. If you want to think of darkness as ignorance, the average people were kept in ignorance by the Roman Catholic heresy. They were kept in ignorance because that's the only way to maintain power. Knowledge destroys oppression. It destroys Roman oppression. And the Roman system is built upon oppression. just yesterday, for some reason, YouTube pushed out to me a really fine archived video from the late brother Wayne Jackson. We all remember Wayne Jackson. Wonderful gospel preacher. So studious. For years he preached in Oakland, California, Stockton, right outside of Oakland, not far from Oakland, which is on the other side of the bay from Looney Town, San Francisco. But what people wonder, why are you there? Well, he was a missionary. He was there to do his duty to help save the Californians. But Wayne Jackson had a 2-part series on problems with the papacy, I think he called it. You can look that up. It was really good. He did a great job. But one of the things he had done, he acquired a book. I don't know where he got it. I don't know if I can ever get it read. I can look through the stores for me. Acquired a book written by, I think, a Bishop Newman, in the early part of the 1800s, who was a Catholic, and he was defending the papacy. And he was saying things, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, saying things like, the Bishop of Rome is the Pope. He's the Father. He's the head of the church. He is supreme. He's over all. He's Christ's vicar upon the earth. We call him Lord God the Pope. He is actually like God himself on the earth. And whatever he does cannot be questioned. Even if he were to be in the wrong, he's the Lord, the God, the Pope, and we must kowtow to him and never, ever question the Pope. Never question the Pope. Now, if that's not just pure power politics, and it stinks to high heaven of the rotting corpses of the Roman legions. I smell them in the background. They're stinking in the background to high heaven, because when they died out, the church just arose in the cemetery where they were all lying. The Romans, the Roman Empire, it was renewed and revivified in the form of the Catholic Church. So the mafia type, the mafioso mentality that was Rome then became the Catholic Church. So that's why I always say it's the mob gone to church. And that's my vivid illustration of what has happened. So you can't have people that know better. You had things happening in the Renaissance, such as scholars who looked into some claims of the Roman Church. The Roman Church claimed that they had authority over the temporal powers. In other words, the Roman Church said we're superior to all governments, all civil governments. Now, there's been a lot of clashes over that because the princes in many of these countries don't want to accept that, and they resist it. But the Roman Church still claims they are over all governments, earthly governments. They by right can rule and should have the last word on everything. Well, the donation of Constantine was a spurious document that had been used for many years to pull the wool over the people's eyes and say, here, according to this was given a long time ago. Constantine was conferred this power by apostolic authority or something like that. Well, the whole thing is bogus. The donation of Constantine was spurious. It was written many centuries after Constantine. And it talks about things that were not even in existence in the time of Constantine. We call those, of course, things that are out of sync. What's the word, Chris? Anachronisms. And the anachronisms showed that the donation of Constantine was false. That was like the first real crack in the wall. And the floodgates opened up after that was exposed as being spurious. And they'd been using that to make their claims that they should be over the earthly powers. This is why people worried when John F. Kennedy was running for president. And well, they should have. Now, to whom will you be first loyal? To Christ, or rather to the government, or to the Pope, the Vicar of Rome? Because you are Catholic. And they were practicing Catholics. Maybe they'll get it right one day, but they were still practicing. They were practicing Catholics, and he always said, oh, of course, to, the Constitution of the United States. Of course. We never had that tested. And now we have to worry about it everywhere. Everywhere you go, Catholics. Catholics here, Catholics there. In our Supreme Court, in the highest echelons of the executive branch, Catholics or Hindus. So our country's on a precarious tightrope right now. Which way will it fall? Maybe some of these Catholics will have a change of heart. And maybe the one I'm thinking about will go back to his hillbilly roots and start remembering the independence of those hillbilly ancestors who were not Catholics. Some of them were. The ones from Ireland were, poor souls. But some were not. Hey, I can claim my Irish ancestry. He was Presbyterian. He was Protestant. But he married a Catholic. first time. Anyway, that's another story. But let's just move on and say Christ is the light of the world in that sense. What if every culture, what if China could be open and more people would accept true Christianity? I don't mean this bogus counterfeit Roman Catholicism. I mean the true things.
I was just in this verse which says, "I'm the light of the world," and you brought that subject up about what if Christ had never existed. Well, I mean, there was light, of course, in the sense of God. You know, God is represented as being light. You know, like in his interfacing with Moses. You know, the burning bush.
Yeah.
And of course, you have the children of Israel when they're wandering, and then of course, you know that the analogy is made. I think it was Paul. Didn't he say that was Christ? You know, maybe not directly the pillar of fire, but you know the rock
The rock that followed was Christ, he said.
But again, you have that pillar of fire by night. I mean, you have this thematic element of literal light, and then you have Christ.
You know, Jews today could argue and say, we already had light. They did have that knowledge of the Creator. That's true. The thing about Judaism was, even though they had been dispersed among the nations and there were synagogues everywhere, they were an enclave. They stayed to themselves, to stay out of trouble, live and let live. They didn't proselytize too much. They did a little bit, but not a lot. They didn't go out of their way to make waves and cause trouble. The Romans left them alone. If Judaism were all they were, they would have never converted the world to the cause of the one Creator. They'd have kept it to themselves. That's the beauty of Christianity. What makes it so different? Of course, it is the culmination of all God was doing in Judaism. It's the apex of Judaism. It's the highest form, although it's not Judaism. It's just true religion. And Judaism was the stepping stone that God used to get there. So anyway, I would say Jesus could say truthfully more than any other figure who's ever lived in history that he was the light of the world in that sense, because the world was evangelized by him. Even today in the East, there are some who are Christians. Many, they say in China, an underground church. The problem with that is hard to keep up with the stats, you know. And there's an official church that's run by the government. It's a joke. It's a Marxist church. They teach Marxist theology and so on. You have Karl Marx posters everywhere, I think. I don't even know if they show signs of the cross in their buildings. And they're registered churches, but they just pretend like they're a church. Then there are real churches, and they have to hide in the homes. And when they're found out, they're mercilessly persecuted, just as you'd have in North Korea. Absolutely impossible openly to practice Christianity in North Korea. You'll be killed for that. Or Saudi Arabia, for that matter. Oh, those are our allies, aren't they? I forgot. But that's the way it is. So he's the light of the world in every sense. And just wish we had more time to expand on that. But I guess Chris did for several months in that whole Bible study about how he's the light of the world.
I mean, that's perfect. I mean, that's a perfect explanation, because you have the limited commission where Jesus said, "Go and talk to the
lost sheep of the house of Israel."
Yeah, and then at the end it was, okay, now go into all the world. So you had this kind of vertical. Here's God, and He's guiding the Israelites, and it's preparing them, and then it's this explosion of light into the world and drawing all men
That's
to Christ. That's
vivid image. I like that. That's a good description of what happened in the first century, just in a few short years. Paul could say in Colossians 1:23 that the gospel had been preached to the whole creation under heaven by that time in the 60s. So by the time, I think that's about when we normally date the Colossian epistle, maybe in the late 50s. I think it's in the early 60s. So, wow, what an accomplishment. So they had taken the gospel, and he is the light of the world. But then one more thing in John chapter 8. We didn't read all of verse 21, I realize. He says, well, let's see, John chapter 8 and verse 12. He says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So again, it requires more than just, physically at that time, following him around. That's not what he really meant. He meant follow him as a disciple, a learner from him. So the Pharisee said to him, you are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. In other words, you're just making this claim and you have nothing to back it up. Now, we've been over this 1,000 times, so I won't repeat what we've studied, but obviously he did perform miracles, and they just didn't pay attention or think that they were adequate. They wanted more and more and more. Jesus did more than that. He said, verse 14, even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. So, Jesus himself thought, what I say I know corresponds to reality. The claims I make, I really am the Son of God. You don't know all that. You refuse to accept it. They could have known it. In fact, others did know it. His followers did know it. His closest disciples, they were following him for that reason. They saw the evidence. Well, I guess we will go ahead at this point and we will stop reading verse into 14. We'll start 15 next time. Any questions or comments, and then we'll give ourselves the break we promised.
I'm sorry, back in verse 12, that walking in the light, it reminds me of, I had to look it up, but it's, First John 7.
Yeah. 1, 5 to 7, yeah.
If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. I don't know, it just reminded me of that verse, because it says that,
Yeah, walking in the light entails the idea it's not just what you know, but you do something based on what you've learned from him. So it's enlightenment of the mind, but it's a lot more than just knowledge. What good would that do anyone to know that Christ is the Son of God if you don't act on it, right? So obviously,
it goes with this verse, because whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of
exactly.
life. But we have to keep walking in the light as he is in the light in order to
We have to keep following him. Good point. And in other venues, we talk about that, how it's conditional. Our salvation, even as Christians, is predicated upon our faithfully following him all of our lives to the end. But if we don't, if we fall back into the darkness, then we have to answer for that.
Plus the fact that, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
There's a lot of good news there, but the fact that he says, whoever follows me, so that's an active word, walk in darkness, another active word, not, once you find me, you're in light.
Yeah.
What I mean? It's
Something you continue to do.
still action, yeah.
Exactly.